WWE fans were not ready for what unfolded live on Monday Night Raw. The date was September 29, 2025, and Monday Night Raw was unfolding with the kind of chaotic energy that had become standard for WWE's flagship show. The crowd was hot, the matches were delivering, and the storylines were weaving together in ways that kept everyone on the edge of their seats. But nobody in that arena, not a single soul among the thousands packed into the venue, could have predicted what was about to transpire in the final moments of the evening. What started as a beatdown would transform into one of the most electrifying returns in recent WWE history, a moment that would send shockwaves through the entire wrestling world and fundamentally alter the landscape of Monday Night Raw. The Usos had been holding their own throughout the night, navigating the treacherous waters of WWE's tag team division with the skill and experience that had made them one of the most for months now, operating as their own unit, trying to establish themselves outside of the bloodline's shadow. It had been a journey of self-discovery for both brothers, a chance to prove that they were more than just Roman's muscle, more than just supporting players in someone else's story. They had won matches, cut promos about standing on their own, and generally tried to forge a new path forward. But the WWE landscape had shifted dramatically in recent months. New stars had emerged, new alliances had formed, and new threats had materialized that made the wrestling world a far more dangerous place than it had been. Among these threats were two of the most physically imposing and ruthless competitors on the entire roster, Bron and Bronson. These two behemoths had formed an unholy alliance, a partnership built on mutual destruction, and a shared love of inflicting pain on anyone who stood in their path. Bron, the second-generation star with an intensity that seemed to radiate from his very core, had been on an absolute tear through WWE. His combination of speed, power, and raw aggression made him unlike anyone else on the roster. He moved with the grace of a cruiserweight, but hit with the force of a super heavyweight. His spear had become one of the most devastating finishers in all of wrestling, capable of turning opponents inside out with its sheer impact. But beyond his physical gifts, there was something almost feral about Breakker, an unleashed fury that made him genuinely dangerous. Bronson presented a different, but equally terrifying threat. The massive Australian powerhouse was a force of nature, a man who seemed to defy the laws of physics with his combination of size and athleticism. Reed could move with surprising speed for someone of his stature, and his aerial arsenal was shocking given his weight. But it was his tsunami splash, that death-defying leap from the top rope that saw all of his considerable mass crashing down on opponents, that had become the stuff of nightmares for anyone who had to face him. Together, Breakker and Reed formed perhaps the most dangerous duo in WWE, a team that seemed unstoppable in their path of destruction. The Usos had been scheduled for a match that night against a mid-card tag team, about that was supposed to be relatively straightforward. They had won the match cleanly, their veteran instincts and years of experience allowing them to control the pace and execute their game plan to perfection. The crowd had been behind them, chanting their names, appreciating the work they were putting in. As the referee raised their hands in victory, it seemed like just another successful night for the brothers from Pensacola, Florida. But then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a brief interruption in the arena's illumination that could have been a technical glitch. The crowd murmured, sensing that something was off, but not yet understanding what was about to happen. The Usos were still celebrating in the ring, Jimmy raising his arms to the crowd while Jay played to the fans on the opposite side. They hadn't noticed the change in atmosphere, hadn't picked up on the warning signs that something sinister was approaching. The lights went out completely. The arena plunged into darkness, and the crowd's murmur turned into a roar of anticipation and confusion. In modern WWE, unexpected light changes always signal that something significant is about to occur, and the fans understood this instinctively. When the lights came back up, mere seconds later, the scene in the ring had completely transformed. Bron stood in one corner, his muscular frame coiled and ready to strike, his eyes locked on the Usos with predatory focus. Bronson occupied the opposite corner, his massive presence seeming to shrink the ring itself. The Usos spun around, immediately recognizing the danger they were in, their celebration forgotten as survival instincts kicked in. They dropped into defensive stances, backs to each other, trying to keep both threats in view simultaneously. For a moment, nobody moved. The tension in the arena was palpable, thousands of people holding their breath, waiting to see who would make the first move. The commentators were frantically explaining the situation to viewers at home, their voices rising with urgency as they detailed the odds stacked against the Usos. 2 against 2 might seem fair on paper, but these weren't ordinary opponents. Breakker and Reed had been decimating everyone in their path for months, and the Usos, for all their skill and experience, were walking into an ambush without backup. Breakker moved first. He exploded out of his corner with terrifying speed, covering the distance to Jey Uso in the blink of an eye. Jey tried to counter, throwing a super kick that would have felled a lesser opponent, but Breakker ducked under it with surprising agility and drove his shoulder into Jey's midsection, spearing him nearly through the ring. The impact was devastating, the sound of body meeting body echoing through the arena like a gunshot. Jey's body folded around Breakker's shoulder before being driven into the canvas with brutal force. Simultaneously, Bronson Reed charged at Jimmy Uso. Jimmy was one of the best in the business at avoiding big moves, his timing and ring awareness honed by years of experience, but even he couldn't completely escape Reed's onslaught. Reed caught him with a massive shoulder tackle that sent Jimmy flying backward into the corner turnbuckles. Jimmy's head snapped back from the impact, his body crumpling in the corner as Reed immediately began driving shoulder after shoulder into his midsection, each blow driving the air from Jimmy's lungs. The crowd was in shock, the sudden violence of the assault catching everyone off guard. The Usos, who had been celebrating victory just moments earlier, were now being systematically destroyed by 2 of the most dangerous men in WWE. This wasn't a match. This was a mugging, an ambush designed to send a message and inflict maximum damage. Bron Breakker pulled Jey up from the mat, only to hoist him onto his shoulders in a power slam position. He paraded around the ring with Jey draped across his shoulders, showing off his strength and dominance before driving Jey down with a thunderous power slam that made the entire ring shake. Jey bounced from the impact, his body going limp, but Breakker wasn't finished. He pulled Jey up again, this time positioning him for another spear, backing into the corner to get a running start. Meanwhile, Bronson Reed had dragged Jimmy out of the corner and whipped him into the ropes. As Jimmy rebounded, Reed caught him with a devastating clothesline that nearly took Jimmy's head off. Jimmy flipped completely over from the force of the blow, landing hard on his stomach. Reed stood over him, a satisfied smirk on his face, before pulling Jimmy up and positioning him for a powerbomb. The assault was systematic and brutal. Breakker and Reed worked with a disturbing synchronicity, taking turns devastating the Usos while ensuring that neither brother could mount any kind of defense or comeback. Every time one of the Usos tried to fight back, tried to create separation or land an offensive move, the other attacker would cut them off, maintaining complete control of the situation. Breakker hit his second spear on Jey, this one even more vicious than the first. Jey's body jackknifed from the impact, and he rolled to the outside of the ring, falling to the floor in a heap. The crowd groaned in sympathy, recognizing that this had gone beyond a simple attack and had become something far more sinister. The referees who had been ringside for the previous match tried to intervene, but Bronson Reed simply glared at them, and they backed off, knowing that getting physically involved would only add themselves to the list of victims. Jimmy tried to fight back, landing a few desperate punches to Reed's midsection, but it was like punching a brick wall. Reed absorbed the blows without even flinching, then grabbed Jimmy by the throat and lifted him high into the air before driving him down with a chokeslam that shook the ring. Jimmy's body bounced sickeningly from the impact, and he lay motionless, staring at the lights, unable to continue defending himself. Bronson Reed looked toward the corner, toward the top turnbuckle, and the crowd began to buzz with dreadful anticipation. They knew what was coming. Reed's most devastating move, the tsunami splash, delivered from the top rope with all of his considerable weight crashing down on a helpless opponent. It was a move that had injured several wrestlers, a move that was genuinely dangerous when executed at full force. Reed began climbing the turnbuckles, his massive frame making the ropes strain under his weight. Each step he took made the ring shake slightly, the entire structure protesting against supporting such mass at such a height. Jimmy lay in the center of the ring, still dazed from the chokeslam, unable to move out of the way. The crowd was screaming, some in excitement, others in genuine fear for Jimmy's well-being. Outside the ring, Jay was trying to pull himself up using the barricade, trying to get back into the ring to save his brother, but his body wasn't responding properly. The spears had taken too much out of him, and he could only watch in horror as Reed reached the top turnbuckle and stood tall, arms spread wide, preparing to leap. But before Reed could jump, before he could deliver that potentially career-ending splash, the arena went dark again. This time it was different. This wasn't the ominous darkness that had preceded Breakker and Reed's attack. This darkness felt charged with electricity, pregnant with possibility. The crowd's reaction shifted immediately from fear to anticipation, a massive roar building even in the darkness. Then it happened. The sound that millions of fans around the world would recognize anywhere, the entrance music that had become synonymous with dominance, with power, with absolute control. Roman Reigns' theme exploded through the arena's sound system, and the crowd absolutely lost their minds. The noise was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. When the lights came back up, Roman Reigns stood at the top of the entrance ramp. The tribal chief had returned. He stood there in his ring gear, his long hair flowing over his shoulders, his expression one of controlled fury. His presence alone seemed to change the entire atmosphere in the arena. This wasn't just a wrestler making his entrance. This was a force of nature, a dominant champion returning to reclaim his territory. Roman's eyes were locked on the ring, where Bronson Reed had turned from his perch on the top turnbuckle to face this new threat, and where Bron Breakker had stopped his assault to stare at the returning megastar. The moment froze, everyone in the building processing what they were seeing. Roman Reigns, who had been absent from television for months, was back, and he was clearly here with a purpose. The commentators were screaming, their voices barely audible over the crowd noise, trying to convey the magnitude of what was happening. Roman Reigns, the longest-reigning Universal Champion in WWE history, the man who had dominated WWE for years, the tribal chief who had ruled over the bloodline with an iron fist, had returned at the exact moment his cousins needed him most. Roman began his walk down the entrance ramp, moving with that deliberate, methodical pace that had become his signature. He wasn't running, he didn't need to. Everything about his body language conveyed supreme confidence, the certainty that he was the most dangerous man in the building and everyone knew it. His eyes never left the ring, never wavered from the two men who had been destroying his family. Bronson Reed climbed down from the turnbuckle, and he and Bron Breakker moved to the center of the ring, standing side by side, preparing to face Roman's arrival. They showed no fear, no hesitation. These were two of the most physically imposing and dangerous men in WWE, and they weren't about to back down from anyone, not even the tribal chief. Roman reached the ringside area and paused, looking at his cousin Jay, who was still slumped against the barricade. Something flickered across Roman's face, an emotion that might have been concern or might have been anger at seeing his family in such a state. He moved to Jay, placing a hand on his cousin's shoulder, checking on him. Jay looked up at Roman, and even through the pain and exhaustion, there was relief in his eyes. The tribal chief was here. Everything was going to be okay. Roman helped Jay to his feet, steadying him, and then turned his attention back to the ring. Jimmy was starting to stir, rolling toward the ropes, trying to create distance from his attackers. Breakker and Reed stood in the center of the ring, waiting, their eyes tracking Roman's every movement. The tribal chief slowly walked up the ring steps, each footfall deliberate and measured. He stepped through the ropes and entered the ring, and the atmosphere became even more electric. Roman stood on one side of the ring, Breakker and Reed on the other, with Jimmy slowly pulling himself up in the corner. The crowd was at a fever pitch, chanting Roman's name, the tribal chief chants echoing through the arena. For several long seconds, nobody moved. It was a standoff, a moment of calm before the inevitable storm. Roman's face was a mask of controlled intensity, his jaw set, his eyes cold and calculating. Breakker looked eager, almost excited at the prospect of going one-on-one with the legendary Roman Reigns. Reed's expression was harder to read, but there was no fear in it, only the confidence of a man who believed in his own power. Then Jey Uso slid into the ring, taking his place beside Roman. Despite the beating he had taken, despite the pain he had to be in, Jey was ready to fight alongside his cousin. A moment later, Jimmy pulled himself up and joined them, the three men standing together, the bloodline reunited in the face of a common enemy. The sides were even now, 3 against 2, though the numbers advantage didn't necessarily mean much given the size and power of Breakker and Reed. But the dynamics had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't two predators picking apart helpless prey anymore. This was a war about to begin. Breakker made the first move, charging at Roman with that explosive speed that had caught so many opponents off guard. But Roman was ready. He sidestepped at the last possible second, and Breakker's momentum carried him into the corner. Roman immediately attacked, driving forearm after forearm into Breakker's head and shoulders, each blow landing with precision and force. Simultaneously, the Usos engaged Bronson Reed. Despite their injuries, despite having been dominated moments earlier, they fought with renewed energy and purpose. Jimmy hit a superkick to Reed's jaw while Jey came off the ropes with a flying forearm, the combination staggering the big man but not dropping him. They moved with the synchronicity that only brothers who had wrestled together for years could achieve, covering for each other's weaknesses and maximizing their collective strengths. Roman pulled Breakker out of the corner and whipped him across the ring. As Breakker rebounded, Roman caught him with a massive Samoan drop, using Breakker's own momentum against him. The impact echoed through the arena, and Breakker rolled out of the ring, temporarily neutralized. The Usos continued their assault on Bronson Reed, hitting him with everything they had. Superkicks and Zwajiris, double-team moves that they had perfected over years of working together. Reed was tough, absorbing punishment that would have finished most men, but even his considerable durability had limits. A perfectly timed double superkick finally dropped him to one knee. Roman saw his opening. He positioned himself in the corner, loading up for his signature move, the spear that had finished countless opponents throughout his career. He pounded his fist on the mat, the crowd counting along with each hit, the energy building to an almost unbearable level. Reed was struggling to get to his feet, dazed from the Usos' assault, completely unaware of what was coming. Reed stood up, turned around, and Roman exploded out of the corner. The spear connected with devastating force, Roman driving his shoulder into Reed's midsection and taking him off his feet. The impact of Roman's spear on someone of Reed's size was spectacular, both men crashing to the mat with incredible force. The crowd erupted, the sound of thousands of people losing their minds creating an almost physical presence in the arena. Bron Breakker tried to re-enter the ring, but the Usos cut him off, both brothers hitting him with suicide dives as he stood on the apron, sending all three men crashing to the outside. Roman stood in the center of the ring, chest heaving, standing over Bronson Reed's fallen form. He looked out at the crowd, his arms spread wide, and let out a roar that was part triumph, part declaration of dominance. The tribal chief had returned, and he had saved his family from destruction. The statement had been made, the message sent to everyone in the WWE locker room. The bloodline was back, Roman Reigns was back, and the landscape of WWE was about to change dramatically. Jimmy and Jey rolled back into the ring, and for a moment, the three men stood together, the image that had dominated WWE for so long. Roman in the center, the Usos flanking him on either side, all three raising their fingers in the iconic one gesture that had become synonymous with the bloodline. The crowd was absolutely deafening, a mixture of cheers and Roman's entrance music creating a wall of sound. But there was something different about this moment compared to the Bloodline's previous incarnations. Roman looked at his cousins, really looked at them, and there was something in his expression that suggested respect rather than dominance, partnership rather than subordination. The months apart had changed things, had altered the dynamics in ways that would become clear in the weeks and months to come. Bronson Reed rolled out of the ring, joining Bron Breakker on the outside. Both men stared up at the reunited Bloodline, their expressions showing frustration but also calculation. This wasn't over, their faces seemed to say. This was just the beginning of something much larger. Roman's music continued to play as Raw went off the air, the final image being the tribal chief and his cousins standing tall in the ring, having turned the tables on what had seemed like an impossible situation.